Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfa and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to discuss the historical Jesus. First of all, we should make a distinction between the historical Jesus and the real Jesus. Right? But what are you saying here? The historical Jesus and the real Jesus and the theological Jesus. There are many different kinds of Jesus. The Jewish Jesus, the Christian Trinitarian Jesus, so on and so forth. Right? And so there's a lot of interpretation as to who Jesus really was. The early church fathers have all sorts of ideas. Like for example, the Neo-Arians believe that Jesus doesn't have a soul. And then the Trinitarians today believe that Jesus is part of the triune God. The historians believe that Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet, right? And there's a lot of different Jesus, right? And all these Jesuses are based on readings of the text that we currently have, right? For example, Giza Vermesh's Jesus is a Jewish Jesus, whereas Tom Wright's Jesus is a completely different thing, right? The Unitarian Jesus is, Jesus died for the sins of the world. He is not an ordinary man, right? Some say that he is a creature, right? This all adds to the debate in the early 3rd and 4th century. And so there's a lot of Jesus out there. And obviously the Muslims will come and say that, no, Jesus is a prophet, right? And then the Jews do not believe that Jesus is a prophet. In fact, the Jews mentioned that Jesus, was a criminal. That's why he was crucified, And so all sorts of different interpretation. So how do we know who Jesus really was? Right? The fact is, if we put all the literatures together, we basically can't know who the real Jesus actually was. Right? I mean, if you approach this from a theological perspective, obviously, if you read what the Quran says, if you're a Muslim, then you believe that what the Quran says about Jesus is the real Jesus. Right? But if you're putting everything together in an academic historical discussion, right, then you want to use the earlier sources and so on and so forth. If you play by the historical game, if you deviate a little bit and go into the realm of theology, so on and so forth, then you can, you're actually arguing from a theological and historical perspective, whereas I'm approaching this strictly from a historical perspective. Now, obviously, as a Muslims, I believe whatever the Quran says about Jesus, right? But that is from a faith perspective. Right? But if we are writing an academic paper, we want to approach this from a historical perspective, right? And so from a historical perspective, if you actually analyze the sources, the very text that we have, right, and approach this text carefully, number one, you conclude that Jesus is actually a prophet, right? You conclude that Jesus is actually a prophet. Jesus obviously existed. He didn't go out to preach outside of Judea, right? He has disciples, and his mother was Mary, right? The virgin birth, historians would not accept, okay, because historians do not believe in the supernatural. Right? And so if you read books by historians that plays by the historical rule, they would probably think that the virgin birth of Jesus, as narrated in Matthew and Luke, is actually something that is false. Right? For example, scholars are able to dismiss the virgin birth of Luke, right, in chapter 1 and 2, because Marcion, our earliest Marcion had an early gospel of Luke, which he uses, as well as several other books of Paul. And in Marcion's gospel, the virgin birth is not there, right? And so this allows scholars to think that this virginal conception, the story of Zechariah, as well as the birth of Jesus in chapters 1 and 2 in the book of Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, is actually a later addition. Right? And so From a historical perspective, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. Now, what does apocalyptic prophet basically mean? Prophet is someone who, apocalypticism is um, like someone who look forward to the end time, who believe, Jesus believed that the end time will actually come. Like Yawmul Qiyamah would actually come during his time, or at least his disciples' time, because he says in Gospel, right, in Mark, right, that you will not taste death until all this thing actually comes, right? That means Yawmul Qiyamah will arrive when you are still alive, right? But then this is also contradictory because in Mark 13:32, right? If we go to the Gospel of Mark here, in Mark 13:32, I just want to make sure that I get the verse right. I'm quoting this from memory. This is about the hour no one knows. Yeah, so I'm reading from the NRSV using the HarperCollins Study Bible here, right? And so we say, but about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Okay, beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. He is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his slave in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. Right? So first Jesus said that no one knows the hour. Right? And then Mark continues narrating, allegedly, what Jesus said, right? Because we do not have the uh, sayings of Jesus extant, right? We do not have the autographs of Mark, right? And so Jesus here is, this is one reading of it. I present another reading afterwards, right? That might not seem to be a contradiction. Is that Jesus is saying no one knows the hour, right? Not the Son, not the angels, but only the Father in heaven. That means only God knows the hour. But then Jesus is saying that you should keep awake. And in another passages, Jesus is saying that all this shall happen. This is about when the disciples go out of the temple, and then they're saying that, oh, these stones are nice, and so forth. And then Jesus said that not even one stone will be left. Okay. And so the disciples, according to Mark's gospel as well as Synoptic's gospel, believe that Jesus believed that the end of times will actually come, okay, during his lifetime, and at least the disciples' lifetime. But obviously 2,000 years have passed, right, and we are still here. The end of the world has not come yet, right? And so this is what scholars call part of the biblical failed prophecy, right? Now, the other reading of it that some have suggested that might not seem to be a contradiction, okay, is that Jesus know that the end of time will come during his lifetime, or at least his disciples' lifetime, right? But he just doesn't know the exact hour when will it be. But he basically has a rough idea, right? But exactly when it will be, no one knows, only the Father, right? So Jesus have part knowledge of it because he knew that the end of times will actually come, right, soon, right, within this period of time. For example, within the next 20 years or so, but we just don't know when will it be, right? So it depends on which reading you actually take, and some scholars actually accept either one of these readings. Obviously, you can't accept both, right? Because it's a paradox. Now, another part is, let's go. Another part is, well, I should have actually discussed the sources, right? The sources that we have that actually allows us to think that whatever we are narrating here is actually correct, right? So let's just go back to the beginning and discuss sources. The sources that scholars normally turn to, right, is the independent materials of Matthew and Luke. Okay, but Mark is the priority, right? Markan priority, meaning because Mark is our earliest gospel, right? And so whatever Mark says, because Mark has been used by Matthew and Luke as well, right? But Matthew and Luke also have their own materials that probably dates around the same time as Mark, right? But who knows, right? This is one interpretation. But what scholars have found out is that there exists a source that is common to both Matthew and Luke, and this source probably predates Mark, okay, or around the same time as Mark, right? And so this source is also an early source, right? It depends, because this is within the realm of hypothesis, right? But no doubt these sources must have existed, because what could explain the similarities between Matthew and Luke, whereas Matthew and Luke do not corroborate, right? They are independently of each other. They do not know each other, yet they still have the same sources, right? And so they must have used one source, right, or a few sources that later on became one source, or however it is, right? We do not know. But whatever the source theory is that Matthew and Luke do have common materials, and they share these common materials, and yet Matthew and Luke do not know each other, right? Luke do not copy from Matthew, nor Matthew copy from Luke, nor do they corroborate with each other, because Matthew and Luke were written around the same time, right? And so they must have used sources that predates them, right, or predates their unique sources, right, the M and L material. And so scholars call the common sources, the common source between Matthew and Luke, Q, right? And so Q predates Mark, in my opinion, but obviously we do not know, or around the same time as Mark, right? Because there's a difficulty here, because I mean, since we are within the realm of hypothesis, if you say that Q predates Mark, right, then how come Mark is not aware of this source, right? And so, I mean, the same argument can be said, right? If you say M and L materials are unique, and they predate Mark, then how come Mark doesn't know M and L material, right? But I mean, even though something predates something, that doesn't mean that people will be aware of that, right? I mean, that's a logical argument. So either way, whatever source theory you accept, you have to understand that Matthew and Luke do share common sources, right? I mean, there's a Pharaoh theory which a lot of scholars reject, and it doesn't adequately explain, right, that because Matthew doesn't copy from Luke, Luke doesn't copy from Matthew, so on and so forth, but they copy from Mark, right? And so if they copy from Mark, and Mark doesn't have these Q materials, meaning they must have originated from somewhere else, right? Unless Mark contains, unless you accept that Matthew is actually first, right? But a lot of scholars reject the Grace-Bach hypothesis. But either way, Q is also the earliest materials that we have. Okay? And in Q material, there is no crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, right? But that doesn't mean that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus in Mark's gospel, right, is not historical, because you have to remember that Mark is actually Mark is also one of our earliest sources, right? But it is just ironic that in the common sources that Matthew and Luke shares, the crucifixion and resurrection is not in there, right? And I've made videos about this as to why I reject the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus from a source perspective, from a historical perspective. It's because of the contradictions, right? And so if there's contradictions, then it is wise to reject all, right? Because how would you know, right, which is the correct one? Unless you accept Mark's gospel or Mark's account faithfully, right? But then again, we do not have the extant manuscripts, the autograph we do not have, so a bit of skepticism is warranted as well. right? But either way, a lot of historians accept the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus in the Markan narrative. Right? They also bring support from Josephus, as well as the pagan writings and Jewish writings, right? But either way, a lot of scholars also see things from a different perspective, right? But either way, if we look at the earlier sources, what was the teachings of Jesus? Probably Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount. Probably Jesus taught that that you shall not steal, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, right? And probably the antithesis section in Matthew, whereby you shall not fornicate, is that you shall not even look at women, for example, right? And that you shall not murder, so on and so forth. So Jesus actually made the law stricter, right? And I think this is historical as well, because it is also mentioned in Luke, right? Not everything, but the Sermon on the Mount, basically discourse, the Sermon on the Mount, are materials that are found in Matthew, right, starting in chapter 5. But these materials are also found scattered throughout Luke's Gospel. Right? And ironically, this is not found in Mark. Okay? Mark, our earliest Gospel. And so, do we accept everything in Mark? Because Mark is our earliest Gospel. Do we accept everything in Mark then? Right? Some would actually accept everything in Mark because Mark is our earliest Gospel. And then because if Matthew and Luke actually, well, Matthew and Luke expanded Mark, right? So they modified Mark, they added the materials to Mark, and some of the materials that they expanded on Mark actually contradicts one another, right? And so in areas that they contradict, we can somewhat eliminate them because we do not know, right? And so Markan priority is a problem. I'm not saying that it is not a problem, because if you look at things that way, meaning Markan priority basically means that you accept Mark and you reject all the other accounts if they contradict Mark, right? Or if they contradict one another, or if they have expanded Mark for some reason, right? For example, in Mark's chapter 16, okay, the final 11 verses, scholars reject them. Right? Not only because of narrative criticism, right, but because that they are not found in the earliest Markan manuscripts, and also the accounts that have been expanded in Matthew, Luke, and John actually contradicts one another, right? And so when they contradict, it is much easier because we reject them, right? And then we follow Mark. But how much do we actually need to follow Mark? That depends on how rigorous you want to be in your methods, right? And how much do we want to accept the Q materials, and how much do we want to accept the Markan materials, right? So again, this is another problem, right, that face historians when they actually want to reconstruct what the historical Jesus really is, which is why you have different historical Jesus. You have the Jewish Jesus, you even have the apocalyptic Jesus. Sometimes these two goes together, right? But sometimes these two don't. It depends on which scholar you actually read. And if you actually read some of these works, they present their methods, and their methods is actually well thought out because they have reasons to support this verse and reject the other verses, right? But then other scholars also have reason to reject, the other verses and accept this verse. And depending on which verses you actually read and look at, you get a different Jesus, right? And so the historical Jesus is not basically one Jesus. There are many different kinds of Jesuses that you can get using historical methods. For example, if you strictly abide by Markan priority, right, then you will not have the charismatic preacher from Galilee called Jesus, right? Because as far as if you read Mark's material, Matthew and Luke portrays Jesus as more charismatic, right? As more, like this, because speeches in Matthew and Luke have been expanded, right? For example, Mark doesn't have the narration that Jesus was tempted, and then the Holy Spirit or the Satan, the shiny ones, right? If you look at it from Hebrew, Satan doesn't actually bring Jesus up to the temple, right? Doesn't bring Jesus up to the mountain. Mark doesn't narrate all this, right? And so, do we accept these materials in Matthew and Luke, or do we not accept? Because Mark doesn't contain it, right? And so, if you are rigorous in Markan priority, then you reject the Matthew and Luke's account about Jesus being brought up, being brought up to the high mountain, to the temple, so on and so forth. And then you also reject the expanded post-resurrection scene of Jesus, right? In John, Jesus dressed up as a gardener, and so you will reject all this because Mark doesn't narrate all this. Because if you accept the other accounts, then basically you have contradicted Mark. Because if you read Mark's chapter 16, verses 8, right? I'm just going to read it to you. Okay. I'll just read from chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. They want to anoint the dead Jesus. And very early on, the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" Which was very large and had already been rolled back. Okay, when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. Chapter 16, verse 5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee." It contrasts with Luke. They confer with Luke. Luke mentions that they should go to Jerusalem. Well, I mean, not go to Jerusalem. They should remain in Jerusalem, right? Matthew follows Mark here to go to Galilee. So they went out and fled from the tomb. Okay, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Right? They said nothing to anyone, meaning when they saw that the man talks to them, right, in the tomb, they were amazed and they were also afraid. Right? And so they did not tell the disciples, okay, because they were supposed to tell the disciples, but they did not tell the disciples, okay, because they were afraid. And they ran away. They were afraid. They never told anyone. Whereas if you look at Matthew, Luke, and John, they go and tell the disciples, right? And so if you accept Markan priority, you would naturally reject, because Matthew, Luke, and John's account contradicts Mark, right? And there's a lot of ground here to accept the Markan account, because Q doesn't contain this account. And furthermore, John's account, Matthew and Luke as well, they contradict each other, right? And so it makes no sense to accept them because they contradict. Now, if you read Mark's Gospel using the KJV or the NIV, let me just go back to my 1611, right? 1611 King James here. Let me just go to Mark's final chapter. You can see here that it goes beyond verses 8. It goes beyond verse 8. Right? You can see it goes beyond verse 8. And it actually goes to the next page as well. So it goes all the way to verse 20, you can see. Verse 20 here. Right? But if you actually look at the NRSV, there's actually a difference here. Am I pointing it correctly? Yeah, the shorter ending of Mark. Hopefully you can see. The short, sorry guys, the shorter ending of Mark. Right. And there's also the longer ending of Mark. If you turn to the next page. Yeah, the longer ending of Mark. So what is this longer ending, shorter ending? What does it mean? You know, why is there a longer ending? Why is there a shorter ending? Right, and just now I mentioned that this verse is actually not, Mark stopped at chapter 16, verse 8, but then, there's biblical proof here that it goes all the way to chapter 16, verse 20. Well, guess what? This is not found in our earliest manuscript. It is not found in our earliest manuscript. Okay, and who says this? Biblical scholars says this. Right? Let me just see here. So the King James contain, the New King James Version contain as well. The almost all the other Bibles contain as well, and some of these have been argued that they are actually in the earliest manuscripts, right? But actually, and if you read some Bibles, for example, if you read the King James Bible, the ones that are not annotated, right? Simply the text. There's no annotation, there's no cross-referencing whatsoever, right? They will never prompt you to say that this is actually not found in the earliest witnesses, right? And so, if you do not have like study Bible, and if you just read the 1611 or even the King James, right, modern King James, all right, there's no notations and so forth, you will not be aware that this verse is actually a later interpolation to Mark's gospel, right? And so sometimes when you actually read books on historical Jesus, and the author actually stopped narrating Jesus' resurrection, saying that the disciples were not informed because Mary Magdalene did not tell anyone, right? And so sometimes you scratch your head because you are not aware. You are not reading the critical. Well, you're not reading the critical text here. This is see, this is in brackets, in double brackets. Yeah, this is Nestle Allen, and it basically says that 9 to 20 is a addition. Right, it is not found in the earliest manuscripts, but it has been included in there, right? Because Bible sales are towards Christians, right? And they still want to sell this, they do not want to make it seem too radical, right? Because the RSV, the first edition of the RSV, if I'm not mistaken, it is actually not there, right? I have the RSV here. From the American Biblical Society. Let me just fact check. If we go all the way towards the end and look at Mark, okay, here Mark 16 to 8, 16:1 to 8, right? The RSV containing as well, but it also indicates that here, the footnote, you can see, I'll just read, I don't think you can see here, but some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. One authority concludes the book by adding after verse 8 the following. Okay, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him and all that they had been told. After this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Basically, this is similar to Matthew's, whereby Jesus said, "Now, okay, go and preach to the end of the world," right? But the critical addition is the point of reference, because you can see, like, just turn to random, you have a lot of these critical notes, right? Variant, the other readings. Some people find it offensive that the word variant readings is being used, right? And so I'll use other readings, okay? Because the King James that I use says other readings, right? Other ancient authorities, they don't say variant, right? But scholars uses variant readings, and so no. But just for the sake of not spreading hate, okay, which we do not want to, we will just use other readings, right? And so 16:9 to 20 are not found in the earliest manuscripts, and there are other readings, right? If you accept, for example, if you read works by evangelical Christians on Jesus, they will include these longer endings, right? And then they will put it into part of the narrative, because Jesus appeared to the disciples, right? And then Jesus ascended, just like in Luke's gospel and the opening book of Acts. Okay, even there's contradiction, right? Because in Luke's ending, Jesus ascended immediately, right? But in the book of Acts, chapter 1, Jesus ascended after 40 days. So, you want to reconcile them, it is up to you, but that is not what the gospel actually says. So what else can we say about the historical Jesus, right? There's a lot of other things, but the parables is the ones I found to be the very strong part, right? Because it is a unique sort of way to speak, right? And the parables, Jesus taught in parables, right? In the synoptic gospels, Jesus taught in parables. And so this is something unique, and this is also found in Q, right? Apart from it being there in our earliest sources, it is also something that is unique, right? And so the parables, if you read the parables, they contain the most wonderful teachings, right? And whenever Christians, fell in love with Jesus, they fell in love with his parables, right? Parables of the mustard seed, parables of the sower, right? Parable of the prodigal son is my favorite. Okay, parable of the prodigal son is my favorite. It is in Luke. It is nowhere else in the other gospels, right? It is unique Lucan material, right? Parable of the prodigal son, because it is unique in Luke. Right, the exact parable, right? It is unique in Luke, and so some people have problems with this, right? And saying, okay, this is unique Lucan material, right? Because this is not repeated elsewhere in the other Gospels with the exact content. We have similar parables in Matthew, right? But not to that extent of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke. Right, and so in Luke's parable of the prodigal son, okay, there's this father has two sons. Okay, one of them actually was obedient to the father, and then one of them decided to rebel against the father, right? And so he went away for so long. He went away, and then whilst this rebel son was away, the father and the obedient son never actually disobeyed the father, right? So the obedient son works in the field, always obey the father's commandment. And then the rebel son realized that, okay, I've been away, I've made mistakes. And so the rebel son actually returned, and the father saw this rebel son from a distance, right? And then they both ran to each other and they embraces one another and they hug one another, right? And then the father asked the slaves to slaughter the calf, the very fat calf, to slaughter. There was celebration, so on and so forth. And so the obedient son felt disheartened. The obedient son says to his father, Father, I've always been here by your side. I've always obeyed you, and so on and so forth. And then the ending of the parable is very, very heartwarming. Yeah, the father says that, oh, you have always been here with me, right? But this brother of yours has been lost and is now found, right? He was dead and he's now alive, right? And so this is a very, very significant teachings, right? And this teaching is unique to Luke's gospel, right? If you look at the ransom passages, okay, that the Son of Man or Jesus dies as a ransom for humanity, okay, as a ransom for many. Mark and Luke actually narrates this, right? And then Luke copies Mark, and then when he comes to this passage, Luke actually, do not copy this very phrase, whereby Jesus must die, okay, and his death is as a ransom for many. Luke actually skipped this, right? And so this is something significant here, right? But then again, historically, a lot of scholars reject because Luke is a gospel that came much later, right? But some scholars have actually argued that because Luke, he claimed that he actually looked at the different sources, right? And then he claimed to have written an orderly account, okay? Whatever that means, right? There's a lot of interpretation as to what this orderly account means, right? If you actually read, study Bible, you have different interpretation. But just for fun, okay, let me just go to Luke. Okay, Luke chapter 1. Okay, here Theophilus. Theophilus basically is God beloved, or it could also mean, a name of a person, right? Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the world, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Right? If you look at the note here, okay, this is in page 1761. Luke sets about the task of providing an orderly account in light of previous attempts by many to narrate the events that have been fulfilled. Okay, and note 1.2, eyewitnesses, stressed by ancient historians, who are also servants of the word, have handed on traditions about Jesus. The author does not claim to be an eyewitness, right? And so part of the reason why scholars actually do not put strongly on this so-called self-declaration, okay, this preface, okay, in Luke's gospel, is because Luke was not an eyewitness account, okay, but so were the other gospels, right? So were the other gospel authors. None of the gospels were actually eyewitness accounts, right? Though evangelical Christians would actually argue differently, right? They would say John, the son of Zebedee, and Matthew, the disciples, the tax collector of Jesus, right? But the gospel themselves never claim to be eyewitness account. At least here, Luke claimed that he is not an eyewitness account, right? He never says that, but he says that he has looked at different sources, meaning logically he must have been writing much later, right? At least Luke here claimed. You want to follow traditions, like if you want to look at claim, because some evangelical works on the historical Jesus actually use the testimony of Papias, as narrated by Eusebius of Caesarea, right? And Papias came much later, whereas Luke here, the very gospel we have, Luke actually claimed, right? Luke have written an orderly account, And why can't we use Luke then as the priority, Lucan priority, right? I mean, I'm not saying that I'm arguing for Lucan priority, because in Luke's gospel it contains many literary themes. Like for example, Luke has a narration of Jesus in the synagogue, right, having discourses with the Jews in the synagogue, and then Jews says that, okay, show us your miracles as you did in Capernaum, right? Whereas in Luke's gospel, Jesus wasn't even in Capernaum yet, right? And so this really shows that Luke have actually edited Mark, because in Mark's gospel, Jesus went to Capernaum much later. So Luke have actually cut off this portion, so to speak, and then put it earlier in his narrative. All right. And if this is what Luke's orderly account really is, then it goes against Markan priority, because it doesn't flow, right? It contradicts Mark in terms of chronology, as well as, we have evidence that Luke actually cut and paste Mark and then just mumbo jumbo it all of his gospels, right? And so this is part of the reason why scholars do not actually support Luke account. But that is from those who follow the historical method. But if we follow the evangelical method, where they accept testimony of papists and so forth, right? What can we just have Lucan priority? Right? Because Luke, as far as we are concerned, is the only gospel to have claimed to have actually looked at all these different accounts and decided to write an orderly account. If we take Luke for what he is saying here, right, we should accept his gospel and we should reject the account of Matthew, Mark, and John, right? Because those gospels do not claim to have been written, in an orderly manner, whereas Luke here claimed. And we can also accept Luke's theology then, whereas Luke doesn't have the death of Jesus as a ransom for many, right? Luke have parable of prodigal son, right? The death of Jesus in Luke's gospel is not an atonement for the sins of the world. There is no mention of such an idea even in Luke's gospel. And this is what makes Luke's gospel unique when we compare it to, every gospel is unique, right? John has all these different sayings, these signs, sources, whereas in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus never even do a single signs. The miracles of Jesus in the synoptic gospels are not called signs. They're called, they're not even called miracles, right? They're basically miracles, but they're not called miracles. Whereas the miracles of Jesus in John's gospel, they're not called miracles. They're called signs, right? And the theme of light and darkness, so on and so forth, is very unique to John. In Luke's gospel, we have this. Okay, the death of Jesus is not an atonement for the sins of the world, right? Whereas in Matthew's and Mark's gospel, they have been influenced by the Apostle Paul. Okay, I'm not saying that they knew the Apostle Paul. I'm just saying that they had access to probably the idea of what Paul was actually promoting, right? Whether Matthew and Mark actually read Paul, or probably Mark, whether Mark actually reads the letters of Paul or aware of the letters of Paul, we do not know, right? Because again, where do Paul get his ideas from? There are two sides, whereas Paul basically made it up, right? But we do not know if Paul actually made it up or was it something that is common during his time, right? Again, if it's something that is common during his time, that means that Luke disagrees with it. Because Luke, if it's common, Luke here clearly refutes, right? And some interpretation have actually mentioned that Luke probably refutes Mark and Matthew even, right? But I don't think Luke knew Matthew. So Luke here refutes Mark. Okay, just for fun, forgive me, I just want to turn to, you can still see me. I just want to turn to some biblical commentary. Here I have Ehrman's commentary on the Bible, right? And let's just explore the orderly account narrative here. Why not? By the way, the Ehrman's commentary was written by two of the great professors. Was because they passed away. Yeah. They're written by James D.G. Dunn, one of my favorite scholars. Okay. According to some, James D.G. Dunn, he passed away. Before he passed away, he became a Unitarian. And there are some ideas of this if you read Jesus and the Gospels. And John W. Rogerson, right? Great scholar, prominent scholar. Here, commentary. This is by David L. Balch. Okay, this is page, what is page? 1104. The Ehrman's commentary of the Bible. Yeah, the author, so this is about the prologue. Okay, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. The author does not categorize this book as a gospel. Very prominent, right? Unlike Matthew and Mark, okay? Mark, in the beginning, this is the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay? Although the Son of God is not original, right? And Matthew also contains this as well, but Luke never mentioned this, right? So Luke, the gospel according to Luke is actually not a gospel at all, right? Which is why Luke mentioned that this is an orderly account, right? This is not the gospel. Luke is aware of the gospel because Luke is aware of Mark, but Luke doesn't have the opening of his materials just as Mark and Matthew has, right? The author does not categorize this book as a gospel, but as a narrative, which others have already attempted. Other ancient historians also use the term narrative of their works. It concerns deeds that God has fulfilled among us. Therefore, not only salvation history that happened centuries or decades earlier in the time of Moses or Jesus, but also now in the time of the author and other believers. Okay. Luke claimed to write more fully than his predecessors. Okay. 2 Maccabees uses similar language. The summary shortens the story told earlier by the historian Jason, who had gone through each matter fully. Right? The historian Dionysius criticizes Thucydides for being lazy in his history and not fully reporting major characters' speeches. Right? He objects that historians narrate military actions fully, but they do not do the same for civic seditions. Luke is observing that the predecessors, including Mark, have not given their readers Jesus's or the apostles' speeches, right? Because Mark hardly contains speeches of the apostles. Since ancient historians conveyed the meaning of their narrative by inserting speeches, we must pay particular attention to them in this gospel. Luke Acts is a religio-political history of the founder, that is, of the predecessors, founder and successors, including both their deeds and words. Right? In other words, here, also part of the reason why historians don't accept the expanded narrative is that how would actually Luke know? Right? How would Luke know this is what Jesus say when some of what Jesus say in Luke is not mentioned in Mark, it's not even mentioned in Matthew, so it is not found in Q. So it is unique to Luke's material, right? And so there is no other way to verify. There's only one sources, which is very weak from a historical perspective, right? And so which is why historians tend to stick to the materials found in Q as well as the materials found in Mark, because Mark is the priority. The Oxford Bible Commentary, let's turn to this, why not, right? Since we have it here. Now, I wanted this video to be about the historical Jesus, but it seems that we've strayed off topic. We're focusing on Luke here. But nevertheless, this is how my videos are. I plan something and then it goes and becomes something else. So this is page 926. Okay. This highly stylized sentence places Luke's writings firmly in the Greco-Roman world. Just what genre it suggests, however, is not easily determined. Biographies did not often have prefaces, and those of historical writings were usually much longer. It has been suggested that it is like those that introduce semi-popular scientific and technical treatises, which were largely designed to hand on the traditions of their particular disciplines. Right? Meaning, here, what the author is saying here, let me just find the author's name, just out of respect. Eric Franklin, right? Eric Franklin, Professor Eric Franklin. So the beginning here, the phrase here is saying that similar to other writings in the Greco-Roman world, okay, Luke's materials is somewhat different because Luke contains prefaces, right? And where was I? Others, many may be for stylistic effect, have written narratives, that is, purposefully ordered accounts, and Luke joins his own to theirs, not without a hint that he is offering an improvement. Okay, the subject of these narratives is the events that have been fulfilled among us. They are not disinterested accounts, but their contents are viewed as the outcome of God's purposes and probably as the fulfillment of earlier expectations. The sources for these narratives were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, most probably a single group who handed down their witness in the service of the gospel. Luke is not claiming to have been their contemporary. His own orderly account rests rather on careful research, right? And so this goes back to the evangelical approach, whereby if they accept the testimony of Papias, right, and they accept Markan priority, why can't they accept Luke's account? And Luke actually is a priority, right? Because Luke actually research, and just as this commentator actually mentioned, right? Luke's his own orderly account rests rather on careful research. Right? We will turn to the anchor Bible after this. Theophilus, lover of God, okay, in bracket, to whom Luke addresses his work, is most likely to have been a real person of some standing and may have been Luke's literary patron. Right? Philosophers in the past, they also depend on patron. Right? That's why we have rich and poor philosophers. I'm not saying that Luke is a philosopher, but patronship is definitely common in the ancient world. It has sometimes been suggested that he was a Roman official, that he was not a Christian, and that Luke was writing to make a case for Christianity and its political innocuousness. If so, the instruction he had received was false, or at least biased, and Luke was seeking to give him the true picture. Right? And so this will make sense if we go by this. Okay? Not that I agree with this, but if we go by this, it will basically means that Luke had written accounts that is true, that is accurate, and there is a purpose why he actually writes this, because the narrative that the Roman officials, his patron, probably Roman officials, even though, why would Luke be giving materials, Christian materials, to pagans, right? When this is another question, but if we look at it, Josephus have been, writing to his Roman patron, right? And part of the reason why Josephus wrote his work is to probably, we don't know, like to probably tell the Romans, the pagan Romans, that hold on a second, no, this is actually what the Jewish people were, because Josephus wrote the history of the Jews, right, all the way from the end, the beginning, all the way to during his time, right? For who? Not for the Jews. Obviously, the Jews already have the history, right? But Josephus wrote probably for pagans, because Jews can literally read the Torah and they have their history, and Josephus uses the Torah as well, right? So it makes no sense for Josephus to write his book to the Jews, for the Jews. Most probably he wrote them for his patron, because he was living in Rome at the time, in the 90s of the Common Era. Theophilus, I'm just skipping here. Theophilus is more likely to have been one who was knowledgeable about the Christian faith. Out of other Romans, he was probably knowledgeable about the Christian faith, which is why he wants to become a patron of Luke. I mean, Allah Alam, he don't know. And who was in fact already a Christian. Right? Again, we don't know. But it makes more sense because during the time Luke was actually writing, right, the temple was already destroyed, and probably Gentiles were starting to become Christians because of the missionary activities of Paul. Okay, and so it is plausible, right? And so Luke here wanted to give Theophilus, his patron, the true account. Okay, again, I'm not going to read the rest because we are straying off topic here. But basically, what Luke here is saying, at least from the commentator's perspective, okay, is that the patron of Luke converts to become a Christian. He was probably a Roman official. He was a pagan, right? He converted to become a Christian, and so he probably have been reading Mark, because Mark is the earlier Gospels, and Luke uses Mark as well, right? And so he probably saw his patron reading Mark, and then when he read Mark, he says that, okay, this is, I disagree with this gospel, so I'm going to research, I'm going to look at the different sources that I have and see, if Mark is actually accurate, right? So what this means is that when Mark was there, when Mark had been written, there were other accounts as well. There were many accounts. Okay. For some reason, Mark is the only gospel, the earliest gospel that survived. Okay, but we do know of many early writings. Okay, Christians wrote many materials, but only a few of them have survived. Okay. But again, this is an argument from silence, right? From a historical perspective, this is actually, bogus. But we are in the realm of speculations here. It is definitely not illogical to think that other sources might have survived, because we do have evidence that other sources survive, even though we do not have them, right? Because Luke mentions, right? Unless you say that Luke is a liar, then you can disregard his entire gospel, right? But no Christians would say that Luke is a liar, not even fundamentalists, right? And so we can believe Luke or we can believe Mark. If we if we use the same method that the evangelical Christians always use, right? They use the testimony of Papias, right? Whereas Papias, the testimony of Papias is only narrated to us by Eusebius of Caesarea, which was writing towards the end of the 4th century. Yeah. And so, no, towards the early 4th century, sorry, the 300s, right? Whereas we have Luke here that actually wrote in his materials, and these materials is found in our early sources, right? We have this account of Luke in our early manuscripts, right? Whereas we have the complete Gospels in Sinaiticus, which is towards the end of the 4th century. I will probably date it through to 350 of the Common Era. All right. At which era do we have the complete manuscripts of Eusebius? All right. At which era do we have the complete manuscripts of the Eusebius? 6th century, right? If I remember correctly, 6th century. And so Sinaiticus is much earlier than Eusebius, right? And so why do we reject Luke then, if we use the same principle that the evangelical these fundamental Christians actually use, right? But either way, I want to look at the Anchor Bible commentary. Finally I got a wireless so I can move around. Let me find here the Anchor Bible commentary. Give me a second, guys. But this is not it. This is Acts of the Apostle. Alright, so this is Joseph Fitzmyer, Anchor Bible commentary. Right. The introduction I'll not read. I'll just turn to the commentary. I mean, you can buy this. I will only recommend 2 biblical commentary, like single, like book per book, and not like the 1 volume commentary, right? I will only recommend 2 Bible commentary when it comes to like single book kind of thing, and that is the Anchor Bible commentary, right? The Anchor Bible commentary and the Hermeneia by Fortress Press commentary, right? Obviously I use others as well, like for example I have the New Cambridge Biblical Commentary. This is on Mark. I have one on Luke as well. But I would not recommend it because for the price that you pay, the discussion is, I mean, I'm allowed to make this review because I have them, right? The discussion is very summarized, and if you add a little bit more money, you will be able to get the Anchor Bible commentary, right? And the Anchor Bible commentary is all that you need for 1 book per books of the New Testament, right? And you can supplement by another 1 volume commentary, right? I have the Ehrman's and I have the Oxford, right? And also because you can also find a lot of these materials in study Bibles, right? You can have this, for example, I would recommend the Anchor Bible. The Anchor Bible I'm talking about, the HarperCollins Study Bible. I would recommend the HarperCollins Study Bible. This is the gold standard when it comes to if you really want to get things from a historical perspective, if you want to keep up with scholarship. Okay, do wait for a few more months. I think do wait for next year, because they will bring a revised edition with the NRSV updated edition, right? At the time of making this video, I've not seen the updated edition yet, but if you want to get this is with the new revised standard edition, not the updated new revised standard edition, okay? So if you want to get the updated ones, the updated translation, part of the committee, the editor, Jennifer Canoe, also a very prominent textual critic, but I mean, I already have it, so I'm not going to get it, right? Now, if you want to get it, you can get it. And so let's go to the commentary here. Okay. By the way, Joseph A. Fitzmyer is a brilliant scholar. Okay, very brilliant scholar. Okay. And this is page, hold on here, this is the infancy narrative, the prologue, okay, or the preface, right? This is the prologue. This is page, what page is this? They always don't put pages in the beginning of the chapter. Okay, page 287, right? Page 287. Since many writers have undertaken to compile an orderly account, okay, this is Luke Fitzmyer's own translation. Since many writers have undertaken to compile an orderly account of the events that have come to fulfillment among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and ministers of the word passed them on to us, I too have decided, after tracing everything carefully, he used the word tracing everything carefully here, brilliantly, meaning it shows some kind of, it paints a picture, whereas he look at all these different materials and he actually he has a stylus in his hand, he traces everything line by line. I like this kind of translation, where it paints a picture rather than just telling you for the sake of telling you and not paint a picture, right? Because if it's more visually, you will remember this, right? Tracing every account carefully, right? These are great, which is what I'm saying. Fitzmyer is actually a great scholar. Just as the original eyewitnesses and ministers of the word passed them on to me, I too have decided, after tracing everything carefully from the beginning, to put them systematically in writing for you, Theophilus. Right? Again, systematically is a word that is not found in the NRSV. Okay, it's not found in the ESV. So that your excellency may realize what assurance you have for the instructions you have received. Yeah. The comment: none of the other canonical Gospels begin, as does Lucan Gospel, with a distinctive literary prologue. The earliest Gospel, Mark, begins almost in medias res. Okay, I don't know what that means. With at most one line of introduction. Okay, now I understand. Matthew begins his book with a genealogy in imitation of Old Testament models, which relates it to earlier Palestinian Jewish literary types. This opening lacks the formality of the Lucan prologue. Okay, the Johannine Gospel begins with an adapted hymnic composition, which shares with the Lucan prologue a certain detachment from the rest of the work. Okay, which is why scholars believe the prologue of John chapter 1 verses 1 to 18, is a later interpolation, right? But some scholars disagree and actually uses Luke's similarity as an argument in support of the prologue. Okay. We will discuss John, right? I think I've discussed John, but I think John is a very interesting gospel. Luke's prologue is constructed as a formal literary period. I'm skipping a little bit here. Some modern English translations, in breaking up the long sentence for the benefit of present-day readers, thereby obscure its obvious literary character. By its very style, the prologue stands out not only from other Gospels, but also from the rest of the Lucan writings themselves. It is a formal beginning. Okay, next page here. It is a formal beginning of the composition and has to be compared with two other passages in the Lucan writings, which resemble it somewhat in style but do not match it in perfection. Okay, they are Luke chapter 3 verses 1 to 2, the formal beginning of the traditional gospel materials at the start of Jesus' ministry, and Acts chapter 1 verses 1 to 2, the prologue to the second volume. I have the second volume here, the Acts of the Apostle. And by the way, this is only chapter 1 to 9. Okay, chapter 1 to 9 of Luke. There's another book as well. So in 3 volumes, you cover Luke. I only have 2 here, but the other one is down there. You can carry on reading here. I mean, I'm not going to read everything on camera because this video is already past the hour mark. And so, going back to the point of this video, which we have deviated, the historical Jesus, obviously scholars will not use Luke to argue for the materials of the historical Jesus, though they will use part of Luke, because only part of Luke that is found in Q, right? Unless one is not rigorous in their methods, so on and so forth. Mark is still the priority, so Mark will continue to be used, to be called upon, and whenever the other Gospels somewhat contradicts Mark and is not found in Q, right? Scholars will not necessarily reject them all, right? I mean, it's bogus to reject all of them because M and L is also an early material, right? Or materials that is, probably Lucan and Matthean only. Obviously, we do not know the genealogy of these sources, right? And so, using the present data, we can say that these are the materials that Luke and Matthew came up with themselves, and then they add marks, and then they add Q inside, right? But either way, mark and priority is first, and which sort of historical Jesus do I accept? And I think Jesus, the apocalyptic prophet, historical narrative about Jesus, I think it's something that is strongly argued for. And a lot of critical scholars believe this as well because they are rigorous in their method. They stick to mark and priority, and they also use as Q materials. They do not actually give a lot of priority to all the other materials, and so they are very rigorous in their sources. So at the present moment, the apocalyptic prophet called Jesus, the historical Jesus, is the historical Jesus that I actually lean more towards. Right? I'm not leaning towards the Jesus of Giza Vermesh, the very Jewish Jesus, and so forth. And I'm not saying that Jesus wasn't a Jew, right? But the Giza Vermesh's Jesus is, very Jewish Jesus, right? But what does it mean to be a Jew even in the first century? Because Jews today have actually, the materials goes back to rabbinical Judaism, right? And so rabbinical Judaism is post the gospel authors, right? And so, but I'm not saying I reject completely everything that Giza Vermesh mentioned in his book, The Changing Faces of Jesus, which I've reviewed, I think. And so, the apocalyptic prophet from Nazareth called Jesus is the historical Jesus that I currently lean towards. Okay? Now, obviously, there's a lot of problems if you look at the historical Jesus and compare it to the Jesus of the Quran. Right? But there's also quite similarities, right? But this doesn't affect my decision to go with the historical Jesus, the apocalyptic historical Jesus, right? Because faith and history is completely different thing, right? And you should understand, you should realize your biases, and actually, recognize your biases, right? Because you can still be whatever you want to be if you stick to that faith, right? But when it comes to writing papers for academia or actually making academic videos or attempt to be academic, then we should stick to the historical methods. But it's so easy. It is so easy to conflate between the different methods. It is so easy to overlook certain items, certain sources, and so it is always best to have another pair of ears, another pair of eyes to actually cross-check. Obviously, those people need to know what they're doing as well, right? To actually cross-check whatever we conclude. But whatever materials I say in this video are not my own materials, right? They are the materials of Dale Ellison, they are the materials of Dale Martin, materials of Raymond Brown, materials of Bart Ehrman, materials of all these other great critical scholars as well, right? And so I tend to incline more towards them because they laid out their methods faithfully, right? They explain their methods, unlike some other scholars who they explain their method as well, but their method is not rigorous, and so they sometimes go deviate into the realm of theology, and I find this a little bit uncomfortable, because they set out to do one thing, and then they, in the middle of it, they do something else, but then they still argue in a conclusion that okay, this is what the historical Jesus really is, whereas No, you didn't, because in the middle you introduce something that actually not historical and deviates from the historical method. It leans more towards theology, and you also use this as part of your argument, right? And part of your argument is somewhat affects your conclusion, right? Whereas you have deviated from the method in the middle of your argument, and so you are not really sticking through. You are not sticking to the straight lane, the straight path, so to speak. You deviate here and there, and then you claim that this is what you've set up to do, and this is what you've accomplished, this is what you've proven. Whereas you've not proven anything. You've actually proven that you're not rigorous in your methodology. And so why would I accept your theory, right? Because clearly your argument is flawed in a sense, right? And so I find it convincing the apocalyptic prophet from Galilee called Jesus is the historical Jesus at the moon, right? But when it comes to faith or devotional perspective as a Muslim, it's completely something else, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to this video, and I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.